Hello and welcome to the third devlog for Cold Trail. I'm Charles, the artist behind the project. My brother Nathaniel and I have been working on Cold Trail for over a year now. Cold Trail is a single-player adventure where you play as a ghost investigating his own death. In this devlog, I want to walk you through how I build a scene. I'll use one of our forest level as an example. This one centers around an old radio tower that the player has to climb. From the start, we knew we wanted verticality to play a big role here. Reaching the top of the tower is what will grant the player the ability to double jump, so it felt fitting that you have to earn that by climbing. Thematically, it just made sense. So, with that in mind, I needed to create something flexible and visually interesting, even though there is two pretty big constraints. First, a forest level is organic and flowing. It requires a specific type of asset that can adapt to this. Also, everything is ultimately leading upward in the sky, where it'll be more and more empty. In more structured and busy area like interior scene or city zones, I'll often use tile map or just sprites. However, for a natural setting like this one, this system is not flexible enough. In this case, I figured that sprite shapes would be a better tool. They need a bit of a setup, but once it's done, they let me build more flowing, organic platforms that really suit the environment. To start an area, I always start with a rough sketch. Just some quick ideas to see what clicks. I tried a few things, but for multiple reasons I explain later, the radio tower concept stood out and gave the level a clear structure. Once I'm happy with the direction, I start building what will be the backbone of the level, in this case, tree trunks and branches. For that, I usually begin with simple 3D model. I could draw all the branches and trunks in Photoshop directly by hand, but 3D modeling gives me a neutral base with a flat light, set color palette, and the same fixed point of view. I'm aiming for reusable assets that fits into the game in all the scene, so locking myself in something very specific is very useful. Once the model's ready, I then bring it into Photoshop and paint over it, add the detail, the small imperfection, and the feeling of wood. The key here is making sure that the texture tiles seamlessly, because the sprite shape relies on that. I use symmetry to help with that, then I manually clean up the scene. I'll also, of course, add the start of the branch and the end of the branch, so it breaks up the repetition and make everything feel natural. Once the drawing's ready, I import it into Unity as a PNG file, slice it up, and then configure the sprite shape profile. For branches, it's very simple. I only need to define the edge. I do the same for the trunks, and just like that, I've got a modular system that I can use to build the level however I want. With all that in place, I can block out the level and start testing. I know the usual advice is to prototype the gameplay first before touching the visuals, and that's probably totally valid, and we do that a little bit with my brother testing very simple shape. But as an illustrator, I really need to see things take shape to stay motivated. I want to feel like the world has potential to be beautiful before I get too deep into the mechanics. I feel like to build an enticing project, we need to rely on our strength as creator, even if it's not the most conventional way of working. We'll see, eventually, if it pays off. Once the layout's in place, I focus on atmosphere and mood. Since the players is climbing non-stop, I wanted to evoke a sense of rising through layers of forest. So, firstly, I separated the level in 3 zones. The zone where there's tree in the background, then the zone where there's cloud in the background, and then the zone where there's just a blue sky in the background. So for the zones where there is trees in the background, I felt that just filling the background with tree would feel very flat. So instead, I started by creating rows of trees separated by fog layer. Really, the fog is just a gradient in this case, but it really gives a nice rhythm and a sense of depth. With parallax, I can also add a foreground and a background level, and that gives me 3 levels of visual spaces. It's a great way to create a sense of richness and movement without needing a huge number of assets. I'll do the same for the cloud area and the sky area later. Lighting is a big part of my workflow. I'm using Unity's URP pipeline, which lets me approach lighting a bit like I would in a digital painting. I start with a general light, which I usually keep fairly dark so I can build contrast by adding smaller, more targeted light source. For an outdoor scene like this one, I mostly use 2 types of light: God rays and light spots. God rays are just blurry white bands I draw in Photoshop in like 2 seconds. But they're super effective for suggesting misty shafts of light coming through the trees. The spotlights are again just white blobs painted with the basic brush in Photoshop, but they work almost like a little highlight or spotlights. I must add that these lighting elements wouldn't be nearly as effective without layering. This is where I really can fake a sense of depth and atmosphere. By assigning these light elements to specific layer, I can make it look like some rays pass in front of the sprites while others stay behind, even though technically everything is on a flat plane. I usually reserve the soft light spots for the main gameplay layer to help key objects stand out, where God rays are often used in the background to build mood. After that, I throw in some post-processing. Nothing really fancy here, just a bit of bloom and saturation to get the atmosphere right. And it's very much still a work in progress. Once the visuals are pretty set up, I shift to gameplay. Since I handle all the art, I try to design mechanics that are doable with my current tools and skills. Originally, we imagined a wilder forest level. No tower, just plants and animals. But animating all that would have been a nightmare. So that's one of the reasons that made us pivot to the radio tower concept. It gives us a perfect excuse to use mechanical elements. Things that can rotate or move with simple scripts and animation. It's easier to manage, still feels grounded, and it fits the tone. Poetic with just a touch of unease. A beautiful, natural forest with a crumbling radio tower right in the middle of it all. For some section of the level, I needed an object that the player could interact with. After some thinking, I settled on crows. It made sense thematically, since they're often tied to death, spirits, and mystery. The first steps was, again, drawing the crow in Photoshop. This time I did not 3D model them because I'm not that good of a 3D modeler, and the crows in 3D would not have felt very much satisfying. I broke it down into parts so I could animate the wings opening and closing using the same base body. To bring them to life, I use Unity's sprite skin system to create a few basic animation states. I'm not trying to create perfect movement at this point. I'm still not that good as an animator, but I just want to make sure the idea works. And it mostly seemed to work. I'll need to refine the motion later to be more convincing when I have some time to better my level as an animator. I also wanted this area to offer a bit of a challenge. There's a lot of ways to do that, but I found that using the environment as an enemy could work. Although, as I stated earlier, one of the challenges of the area is the fact that the more the player progress, the less there is, since we are going in the sky through the clouds. So, after some brainstorming, the most obvious obstacle that I could play with was the wind. Simple wind gusts that can push the player off the tower. Once again, after the idea seemed decent, my first instinct is always to get the visual working. So, I created 3 different particle systems that, when triggered together, simulate a strong gust of wind. Unity's particle system is pretty robust, and even with my limited coding experience, I was able to push the idea far enough to test. I also wrote a quick visual script to test everything. Of course, my terrible script will make my brother laugh, but for prototyping, it gets the job done quickly, and it helps me by catching the most obvious mistake in my pipeline. There are a few other elements that I'm skipping over to keep some mystery, but that's the general process for the whole scene. I also added some props that tie into the story and help give this section more personality. Now that the scene is built and the core puzzle are set up, it's just a matter of refining and, well, coding everything. But that's not on my plate. If you've got any feedback on the devlog or the game itself, I'd love to hear it. I tried to go a bit deeper this time since some of you asked for more details after the last video. And of course, if you haven't already, wishlist Cold Trail on Steam. See you next time!